Before the word serial killer existed, America had one. He rode the rails, carried no weapon, left no trace, and turned small-town America into a morgue. Villisca wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was one stop on a blood-stained line. Welcome to Crime Standstill Deep Cuts. I'm your host, Kerrie Droban. Thank you for joining me. Before I get into it, I'd like to ask a favor. If you like these grisly stories, let me know by subscribing and liking and sharing my podcasts. Many of you have already, and I'm truly grateful. It helps to know that this mic is on. And if you've ever wondered why and how I have such insight into these disturbingly dark predators, check out my latest book on Amazon, Surviving a Psychopath, In Court, in Life, and in Love. Available also on my website, kerriedroban.com, and where all books are sold. Villisca, Iowa, 1912. A town so small you could walk its main street in 10 minutes flat, where neighbors borrowed sugar, children roamed free, and church bells marked time. You know that kind of town. But one June night, that rhythm stopped, because someone, no one knows who or why, walked into the Moore family's white two-story home with an axe and turned it into a grave. 8 people, Josiah and Sarah Moore, their 4 children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul, ages 5 through 11, and 2 visiting girls, who unfortunately chose that night to spend the night, Lena and Ina Stillinger, all bludgeoned to death while they slept. It began like any other Sunday. The Moores spent the day at church for Children's Day, a celebration that Sarah Moore had organized. After the evening program, the family walked home under the soft flicker of kerosene lamps. With them, Lena and Ina, who'd been invited to stay the night. How unfortunate how fate had intervened for them. Sometime after midnight, the killer, or killers, entered, likely through an unlocked door. Now, in 1912, that wasn't strange, and in this town, nobody locked doors. They trusted one another. But this intruder wasn't a thief. He was methodical. He carried Josiah Moore's own axe from the shed into the house. He struck each of them multiple times, lifting the axe so high at one point that a piece of the ceiling was dented. Then the killer or killers backtracked through the crime scene, bludgeoning the victims dozens of times more, striking Josiah at least 30 times in the skull, even after he was already dead. And here's another weird fact. All the mirrors were covered with cloths. The bodies were covered with bedclothes. And the evidence suggested that the killer lingered, ate food from the kitchen, left a plate of bacon on the table, and another slab of raw bacon beside the girls' bodies, as if making some kind of macabre offering. There was even a bowl of water that some reports say was used to wash the killer's bloody hands. It wasn't a crime of passion. It was a performance. By 7:30 the next morning, the Moore's neighbor, Mary Peckham, noticed something was wrong. No one was outside. No chores were being done. There was no sound coming from the house. She called Josiah's brother, Ross Moore. Ross found the doors locked, which was a rarity, again, in this town. He stepped inside, and he found the bodies in every bed. Then the local marshal arrived, then the coroner, and then half the town. I want you to think about that. Imagine the trampling of that crime scene. Within hours, hundreds of townspeople had gone through the house, picking up objects, touching the walls, even taking fragments of Josiah's skull as a souvenir. Can you imagine? There was no crime scene protocol, no fingerprinting, no order, nobody in charge, apparently. The Villisca axe murders became a carnival of horror before the investigation even began. And in the days that followed, suspicion turned neighbor against neighbor as people started pointing fingers at who might have done this horrific crime. Children were kept home from school. Families slept with guns beside their beds. And when fear takes hold of a small town, reason is the first to die. Theories multiplied as fast as the headlines. There were 5 main suspects, each as strange as the crime itself. One leading theory was that Frank Jones, a rival hardware seller and state senator who used to be Josiah Moore's boss before the Moore patriarch left in 1907, before Jones began his own local business. They thought that Frank Jones was the competitor and therefore must have been the culprit. Some said Moore had an affair with Jones' daughter-in-law. There's always a woman involved. Others whispered that Jones hired a hitman to settle the score. That hitman had a name: William, aka Blackie, Mansfield. He was a transient railroad worker with a violent past. Mansfield was suspected in several axe murders across the Midwest, each sharing chilling similarities. Victims bludgeoned in their bed, mirrors covered, bodies posed. I mean, think about this for a minute. An axe is a pretty weird murder weapon to begin with, but maybe not in 1912. But for somebody to have committed multiple murders across the Midwest using an axe in the same manner as what happened in the Moores case, that's pretty compelling. But when questioned, Mansfield had an alibi. Of course he did. In 1912, alibis were taken at face value, which means nobody investigated the alibi. They just believed this man with a violent past who just happened to be traveling around with an axe. Then there was Reverend George Kelly, a traveling minister, small and wiry, known for his eccentric behavior and his fascination with sex and death. There's a great combination. He'd attended the same Children's Day service that night and left town the next morning on a train. Kelly later wrote bizarre letters to police and investigators describing the crime in unsettling details only the killer or killers would have known. In 1917, after a marathon interrogation, Kelly confessed. He said God had whispered to him to, quote, slay the wicked. But his confession was inconsistent, full of contradictions, and after recanting, he was ultimately acquitted. But even so, townsfolk never forgot the look in his eyes. They described it as hungry. So why would anyone confess to 8 murders if they didn't do it? Well, there is a strange phenomenon in criminology that sometimes people confess to murders they didn't commit. We saw that, perhaps, in the Menendez brothers case. It's rarely as simple as wanting attention or playing games with the police. More often, it's the slow erosion of the mind under pressure. After hours of relentless questioning, bright lights, no food, no sleep, truth starts to blur. Promises of leniency whisper through the haze. Just tell us what happened and you can go home. Then threats follow when that doesn't work. Fear takes over, and confessing feels like the only way out. Some even begin to believe the story themselves. Suggestive questioning like, "You hit them with an axe, didn't you?" plants images that bloom into false memories. And for others, the confession is a strange kind of relief. It's a way to punish themselves for something else that they did, or to protect someone that they love. There are those who crave notoriety, too, who step into the spotlight of someone else's crime for a fleeting moment of significance. As weird as that sounds, whatever the reason, a false confession is a window into the fragility of the human psyche, how desperation and guilt and the hunger for certainty can twist a person's sense of reality until they no longer trust their own mind. Hopefully, none of us have been in that position, nor ever will be. But months after Villisca, Henry Moore, who murdered his mother and grandmother with an axe in Missouri. Again, what a strange coincidence. He was convicted in December of 1912. Shortly after, investigators later tied him to as many as 23 axe murders, including Villisca, based on timing and method. He was a drifter who traveled, again, by train. But there was no forensic proof that linked him to Villisca, only similarities. At that time, law enforcement was fragmented. Each jurisdiction investigated in isolation. There was no national crime database, no FBI yet. The Bureau of Investigation wasn't even founded until 1908, and it lacked a national reach. The coroner, the marshal, even private detectives competed for attention, not answers. Newspapers fueled hysteria, printing wild theories about satanic cults and traveling axe gangs. There was no forensic science at that time either, no fingerprint standards or blood typing. Investigators couldn't scientifically connect scenes. So by summer's end, Villisca was consumed by paranoia. Posses formed, carrying shotguns. Neighbors turned on each other. They scoured train yards for suspicious strangers. And when the law failed, the mob took over. Vigilante justice took over. That's the psychology of small-town justice, fear disguised as righteousness. Contemporary criminologists see this series as one of the first itinerant serial killers in U.S. history, a forerunner to figures like the Zodiac or Israel Keyes. The killer's ritualistic staging, covering the mirrors, covering the faces, adjusting the lamps, lingering at the scene, suggests a psychologically driven offender with voyeuristic or fetishistic impulses, rather than a robber or a revenge killer. These murders were intimate. Intrusion homicides, as they're sometimes called. The killer got some psychological gratification from penetrating private spaces, a violation of boundaries. The fact that they covered mirrors and faces could have signified some kind of ritual, a symbolic undoing of identity, if you will. In voyeuristic crimes, the act of watching is as powerful as the act of killing. And, of course, taking a domestic safety scene, right, a bedroom, a house, and turning it into a place of fear or horror. Special Agent McClaughry, in 1912, compared evidence from Villisca, Monmouth, Ellsworth, and Puyallup. He publicly theorized that a single, quote, maniac was responsible, following the rail lines east to west. But his findings were published in regional papers, but they were largely dismissed as alarmist. Investigators and later criminologists noted that each murder site lay within walking distance of a railroad junction. So the killer may have been a transient, a laborer, a railroad hobo, hopping freight trains to avoid detection. The mobility explained how he could strike multiple towns across multiple states without ever being recognized or tracked, particularly given the lack of interstate policing at the time. Between 1911 and 1913, there were a string of nearly identical family axe murders. I mean, can you imagine this? I mean, until I started researching the Villisca axe murders, I had no idea that there was this large string of nearly identical family homicides that occurred along major railroad lines across the American Midwest and South, including Colorado, Kansas, Illinois, Missouri, and Iowa. In 1911, Colorado Springs, 2 families, the Burnhams and the Waynes, were killed with an axe. Their windows and mirrors were covered. Their lamp wicks were removed. The axes belonged to the victims, and there was no robbery. In 1911, in Ellsworth, Kansas, the Showman family was slain. Lamps without chimneys were found near the bed. The victims' faces were covered. June 1912, in Paola, Kansas, the Hudson family was murdered. The killer had covered the mirrors, the axe was left behind, and the house was near the railroad. This occurred just weeks before the Villisca axe murders. In Monmouth, Illinois, October 1911, the Dawson family was murdered. They were struck in bed, their faces were covered, their mirrors were draped, and the axe was found. It also belonged to the family. Investigators noted in police reports that the murders were, quote, ritualistic. And then, of course, in June 1912, we have the Villisca family, the Villisca murders, the Moore family. All identical hallmarks repeated. Each crime shared eerily similar features. Pattern, details, weapon, close to the railroad. Weapon belonged to the victim, nighttime intrusion, attacks occurred after midnight while the victim slept, and total family annihilation. Entire households murdered. Bodies covered, mirrors, windows, faces covered. Lamp manipulation. Food or bacon left behind. In some cases, food was prepared or left uneaten. Often, bacon or meat was found near the bodies, and these were train towns. No thefts or sexual assaults. Motive appeared to be either ritualistic or compulsive, and the killer vanished without a trace. No one ever saw him arrive or leave. And investigators later noted that each murder site lay within walking distance of the railroad. So, why would the killings suddenly stop in 1913? So all of these murders that I've just described, spanning at least across 4 different states, all happened between 1911 and 1913. So what does that mean? Well, oftentimes serial killers will have a cooling off period. They'll have a time that spans sometimes a couple of years where they're just, either they've gone to prison, they've moved across county lines where no one's connecting the dots, maybe they marry, get sick, find God, some of them die. It's unclear, but there is an established pattern with serial killers that this happens. Sometimes the violence will shift underground. Maybe the cops are getting too close, although it didn't seem that way in this case. They might re-emerge later. They might change their MO a little bit. They might evolve, and we just don't know. And then there are the ones who actually never stopped at all, but we just stopped finding the bodies. So methods can change, victims can disappear into the margins, and the killer learns how to be invisible. Over a century later, the Villisca Axe murder house still stands. There's paint peeling off of it, white clapboard walls, a symbol of frozen terror. It's one of America's most notorious haunted sites, as you can imagine. Visitors claim that they hear children's laughter, like disembodied voices, footsteps in the attic, lamps swinging on their own. Some guests leave in the middle of the night, unable to make it until morning. Paranormal investigators have recorded whispers and cold spots and flashes of light, but maybe what haunts that house isn't ghosts. Maybe it's memory or collective fear embedded in the floorboards, because every creak, every shadow is the town's unfinished sentence. More than 100 years later, people still travel to stand in the dark and listen, maybe hoping for a clue, maybe just that fear factor, maybe to feel the weight of what happened there. Maybe the killer was a stranger who passed through, or maybe it was once somebody they called a neighbor. Maybe the reason this case endures isn't because it's unsolved, but because it reflects something we fear the most: that evil doesn't always break in from the outside. Sometimes it's already home. Thank you for listening. This is Crime Stands Still. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and for God's sake, keep the doors locked.